Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. Today is November 27th, Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. I have a special episode of the podcast today that's based on a long interview with James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. James has been a frequent guest on the show. And we had a chance, Thanksgiving week, Tuesday of this week, to connect by Skype between his home in Greater Boston and where we're staying here on Sanibel Island in Florida. The topics we covered include COVID, sunlight, schools, Thanksgiving, vaccines, the next big pandemic, Amazon's foray into prescription drugs, new research that James is working on at Forrester about workplace strategy post-COVID, and also forgiveness. Quite touching part of our conversation toward the end as I asked him about what he's learned about forgiveness since the last time I spoke with him. I began by recalling an early take that James had back in February, writing to his family about what was ahead with the pandemic. Your mid-February letter to your family is looking more and more prescient, because that's when you said you thought we might see as many as 300,000 deaths in the U.S. The current number is 257,651. Yeah. And given where we are there and looking ahead, what do you see in terms of deaths here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the challenge is when I put out that number, I wasn't thinking, is that for a year? Is that for, the entirety of the pandemic? Because at the time I had no idea how long the pandemic would last. Would it be a 2-year thing or a 1-year thing? So, we're going to exceed 300 in the life of the pandemic, especially given where the numbers are right now, the rate of new cases and so on. What's, of course, is so very interesting is that the fatality rate is going down, as is the hospitalization rate. Now, there's a couple of good possible explanations for that, all of which are hopeful, but we really won't know how much of that effect is because we have everything from improved methods for treatment, improved attention to interpersonal hygiene, and so on. The one factor that I'm watching really carefully is just the interesting research about vitamin D, exposure to sunlight, which is not just about vitamin D. It's also about nitric oxide, which gets generated by your skin's interaction with sunlight. And interestingly, it was back in June, or May probably, some hospitals and practices were experimenting with supplementing nitric oxide as a way to keep people oxygenated. Nitric oxide is crucial to getting the oxygen off of your red blood cells and into your body's cells. You can't really do it without it. And so they were finding that it was helping people in hospital to have supplemented nitric oxide. So all of those are just open questions, meaning that the fatality rate could go back up after 2-3 months of darkness in the Northern Hemisphere. If it doesn't, if the fatality rate doesn't go back up to where it was in March and April of last year, that's wonderful news, because it does mean that our medical practices, all of our hygiene practices, our contact tracking and tracing and all of that has paid off, and that's what I'm hoping. Meanwhile, we had the vaccines, and that's a wonderful bit of news to end the year on, especially because even with the most optimistic projections, it's going to be 6 months before those vaccines really have a profound effect on anyone other than first responders, highest risk, medical care personnel, and so on. So we're all in this for another 6 months. So do we eclipse 300,000 by that 6 months from now time period? And the answer is probably yes, we do. It's just a question of if the death rate goes back up, it's going to exceed 300,000 by a large number. If the death rate stays where it is, the fatality rate, then I think it won't be too high over 300,000, and that would be wonderful.
What was the death rate back in March in that period?
And it's tricky, of course, because you have to do it on a base of confirmed cases. And because testing was so sparse early on, confirmed cases were lower than actual cases. We just don't know by what factor. And so, if you think about a typical influenza year, it's a 0.1, 0.2% fatality rate of presumed cases.
Oh, mm-hmm.
When you look at the earliest data that we were getting from Italy, we didn't get as much data from Asia, but the April-May fatality rate of presumed cases was about 0.8%. So 4 times deadlier than the worst flu year, 8 times deadlier than an average flu year. And that's why it was, people were saying, it's 0.8%, it's 0.8%. It's like, yes, but the relative effect of it. Plus, it seemed to be very, very contagious, more so than the flu. Mm-hmm. And so, you add that up. We've talked about this. You add up the contagion rate, you add up then the fatality rate, and that's where you get a true emergency, which we did. We had a true emergency. Now, the presumed case rate back in April, May, we now have better testing. We now have a better sense of what the presumed case rate probably is. If you are still using a confirmed case rate, fatality rates are somewhere in the 0.4 to 0.6 range. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they are down, which is great. It's still 2 or 3 times as deadly as a bad flu year. Mm-hmm. And right. So we have to be continuously serious about this. You don't breathe a sigh of relief and say, oh, it's all back to normal. It is not. And as I say, as we watch the effect of reduced sunlight, all of the bets that people were making about, this country handled it better, and it got very politicized in the U.S., but as the northern latitudes have seen the sun disappear, just look at where all the cases have exploded, including Sweden, including the UK, including North Dakota, South Dakota, regions where there's a whole bunch of factors for social density, number one, population density. They shouldn't have had the kind of fatality rates infection rates that we've seen in the last month. But it coincides perfectly with this moment at which the sunlight becomes diminished enough that people stop synthesizing vitamin D. And there's this technical issue. It's vitamin D synthesis is not about a gradual curve where the less sunlight you have, the less you do. There's actually a threshold effect, if I understand it correctly, where vitamin D synthesis doesn't occur below a certain threshold, really at all. And that's one of the reasons why for years we've studied seasonal affective disorder, a depressive condition that many people experience. And it happens at northern latitudes, and it happens sort of on cue every year as your latitude gets below a certain sun threshold, where the angle of the sun and the amount of time in the day that the sun is up. I mean, we're here outside of Boston. It's dark at 4:30. Yeah. And that's just the way we live up here.
Well, it wasn't the reason for our migration to Sanibel, but did we get far enough south to have a benefit on that dimension?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you're quite a ways down Florida, right?
Yeah, at Fort Myers, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked at what the latitude ratings are, but you may not hit the threshold at all down there. That's interesting. You might have done exactly the right thing from just a pure vitamin D and nitric oxide perspective. Yeah. And frankly, there's so little that we know about what the sun really does for our health. So, good for you, because at the minimum now you're going to be able to walk more regularly, be outside, breathe fresh air, more than some of us once it starts to get icy and snowy up here. So, the direct and the indirect effects of sunlight are going to be very, very good for you.
Yeah. How about schools? We had I had my grandson in first grade in Lexington, Mass. I think has had sort of a partial going to school very carefully. What's your assessment of what we learned in the last few months about the pros and cons of sending kids back to school?
Yeah, I have evolved on this quite a bit. When our schools here in Boston started to say we're going to close, and this is back when we had our original spring break was going to happen. And so the schools let out a week early for spring break and said, let's just take 2 weeks off. No school. They posted a few online exercises that students could do if they wanted, but they weren't graded. So, of course, my students didn't do them. But I remember thinking back then, this is serious enough. And if the fatality rate had been had stayed at 0.8% this whole time, I would think I would not have changed my mind on this. But coming back to the fall, looking at the data on what's happening to kids' education, socialization, stress and anxiety without the ability to interact with their peers as regularly as they might have before, that has been particularly difficult for them. So I have switched around on this, saying, look, we do know that the contagion rate is lower among children. Now, that doesn't save teachers, which I'll get to in a minute, but let's just talk about children. The younger you are, the less likely you are to even contract it, much less experience it harshly, and even, it appears, to spread it to other people, less likely. So, from that perspective, I'm much more confident this time of year than I was back in April, May, that we should be trying to do some kind of in-person school, as long as the community hasn't reached some kind of saturation point where the community is already experiencing, widespread community transmission. And that's the big issue. And it's mostly for teachers and staff. Mm-hmm. If the teachers can't be in a safe environment at home because their home is part of the community, it doesn't matter how safe they are when they go to school, they're interacting with other teachers. Now, in all of this time, my wife has made the decision to go back to teaching precisely because our local school district is desperate for teachers who are able to. Many teachers have had to leave the classroom because they have family members at risk, personal health conditions, all the comorbidities that are predictive of dire consequences. If you have any one of those, which many people do, we're talking diabetes, asthma, more diabetes than asthma. All of these things are risk factors, and the percentage of people that are experiencing those challenges mean that your average school, you're going to have some percent, 10, 20% of teachers and faculty and staff who will not be able to be in the classroom. So that's happened in our school district, even though our school district has decided to come back to in-person schooling. And so my wife has decided to go back. She's teaching fourth grade full-time as a full-time substitute. It is good for her, and she's good for them. And I feel like this is one of those times where we need evidence that people are willing to support their community. She's doing her job, but so are many others. Teachers, parents, staff, they're just working tremendously, and they're being very, very safe. So I have no concerns about her experience there, and I know her kids are better off because she's interacting with them. Think about what a fourth grader would do if they had to be full-time remote. And I know there are fourth graders around the country who are full-time remote. Yeah. Your parents have to become your teachers, but parents are working, many of them from home. And so it's just a tremendous challenge, and I'm really grateful she's able to do it. Will there possibly come a time, they had last week, for example, in my son's middle school, they had to shut down the middle school for 2 days because of cases that they then tracked and traced and worked very carefully to make sure that everyone who was affiliated with those individuals or who had been in those same spaces was contacted. And that's just the way we have to be. We have to be vigilant about it. Our superintendent here of our town schools has been very, well, first of all, just incredible throughout this whole thing, empathetic, thoughtful, but at the same time decisive. And he has sent around probably one of the most heart-wrenching messages. Please, please, please don't travel for Thanksgiving. Don't bring this back into our school community. I know it's hard. He says, I have my own 3 adult children who will not come home for Thanksgiving this year, even though we desperately would like them to. I support that. And let's get through this. Let's get to the vaccines. Let's make sure we actually approve multiple vaccines and get them all out there. And then let's track the long-term effectiveness of all of them, because it won't be the case that all of them are equally effective for everyone for the same duration. I mean, this might be the kind of thing we need to booster every 2 years or every 4 years, or worst case scenario, every year. So let's find out. If we find out that the Pfizer one is great at initial immunity and the Moderna one is better at long-term immunity, that's data. We want that data, and that's going to be crucial, and it'll be especially useful for the next big one. Now, everything that we've learned, when the next one comes, we'll know a little bit more about how to approach these.
Wow, just those words, the next one sends a shiver down my spine. And also because you had mentioned Dr. Nicholas Christakis last time we talked at Yale, good source of information on the pandemic. And I listened to an interview he did on NPR. He looks at human communities, behavior, the big picture. And what he said he's seeing is that the pandemic's direct effects will extend into 2022, and then recovery from the social and economic shock is another 2 years. So you're all the way to 2024 until this cycle of plague that has been observed, often in human history, runs its course. That was shocking to me to think that it's that long a road that we're on. And I wonder if you agree with that sense of the timetable, and what does it imply for businesses and citizens for if you knew that was ahead and accepted it, what would you be doing now that maybe we're not doing because we have this illusion that, well, there's vaccines and we're all going to be back on the beach next summer and everything's going to be over soon. It seems like there's a real disconnect from maybe we have to believe some happier version just to get up in the morning, but the facts seem to be pointing toward a very long future in this situation.
So I respect him tremendously, and I understand why he's saying what he's saying. And I think he is probably wise to say that, but I also do think it's a worst case scenario. I think he's correct about the virus. Of course he is. He's the expert in that area. And just the amount of time it's going to take to distribute vaccines. There will be initial resistance from certain populations to take the vaccine, all of which is understood. We know it's going to happen. That's just the way it is. So we're looking at, next holiday season, 2021, before people can not have to stop and say, should my kids come back for Thanksgiving from college, or should we not get together with grandma for Christmas? That's a year away. But next summer, we will have already more freedom to travel. There's an amazing number, which is, I can't remember if it's just Americans or it might be Americans and Europeans as well. I know it wasn't the whole world, but consumer savings has gone up by trillions.
Wow.
If I'm not misquoting the number, I'm not going to say the number because I'm pretty sure I'm misquoting it, but it's trillions. It's in the low trillions that consumers have saved above the base savings rate that they normally would have saved in the same comparable period. Now, that's obvious because, first of all, people are concerned about the future. They put some money away. But it's also because they can't spend. They can't spend on that vacation. You can't go to Europe. And, we live here in Boston, so we're very close to Europe, and making a trip to Europe is very easy. It's actually shorter to fly to London than it is to L.A. And so, the thought of not going to Europe for another couple of years is kind of devastating to us here. And I know that's a first world problem for sure. But think about it. We're not the only ones who don't have the things that we could have spent our money on. And we're making different choices about how to spend our money. So that means the savings rate's up. What does that mean? It means that once we do get through the worst of the vaccine, there's a lot of money to be spent. Now, there's a very kind of Protestant work ethic part of me that wants us to just take all that money that we've saved and keep it in the bank. That would be the prudent thing for us to do. And if I'm advising anyone personally, the answer would be yes. Keep it in the bank. Keep it, in investments. Keep diversified. But keep it in savings because you're going to need that money for long-term health care, for caring for aging parents. You're going to need that money. But I also know that that's like shouting into a hurricane or a whirlwind. People are going to suddenly feel like they have just money burning a hole in their pocket, and they're going to go, I don't want to use the word crazy because that almost sounds pejorative. I want to make it value neutral. They're going to spend. They're going to spend.
Pent-up demand.
It will, and we are going to see, and I've told our luxury goods clients, and I think we may have even mentioned this before, you and I, we're going to see luxury goods explode. all kinds of people. The people on the high end who already can afford luxury goods, but also the people in the middle of the economy who occasionally indulge in a high end good, whether it's a very high end champagne for a wedding or a high end watch. And it may not be the Rolex, it might be the Bulgari or whatever it is. But and I say those names as if I even know what those cost. I don't even know. My most expensive watch ever is the one I'm wearing now, and it's because it's a GPS running watch from Garmin that lasts for 24 hours, which is of GPS running. And, I'm talking hundreds of dollars compared to the tens of thousands that some of those watches cost. So luxury goods are going to go up. It'll be exactly the right time for some of the vehicles that have been released. Even the electric Mustang from Ford, which I'm watching very closely. That's one that's going to take off. It'll hit the market right at the right time. Now, does solve problems? No, it doesn't. And will the economy still stretch out? And is Christakis wise to warn us that the economy will still have issues? Certainly, the employment issues are significant. The education sector is going to be hit for the haul. We'll see what the effect of all of this is on people enrolling in medical school and nursing programs and physician assistant programs. Will there be a dramatic call to those professions as people say, that's where I want to be? Or will there be a slacking off of those professions? And a tightening of supply. There's already a tightening of supply of physicians in the market because for the last 10 years, largely due to changes in the way insurance and the government handle payments, doctors just don't get as much return for their medical school investment. So people are less likely to do that. And, will that happen now as people say, gee, I could be the hero or I could go be an accountant? It'll be interesting to see what happens there. So there will be long-term effects, and he's wise to point those long-term effects out to us. But at the same time, there will be an amazing amount of money. Unless something awful happens with the vaccines, and none of them are effective at all in practice as of next summer, unless that happens, we'll start to see people plan those vacations. The cruises are going to book up. You will not believe it. They will book up for 2022. They will be booked to overflowing.
Interesting. Well, I'd like to turn to talk about Amazon and their foray into prescription drugs. CVS, Walgreens, some others took some big hits. I also saw somebody quoted in the FT saying that's an overreaction. People like going to the pharmacy.
Never say that a retail industry is safe because people like to go there.
Yeah,
like that's been proven wrong over and over and over. I did a research project for public television 15 years ago, where they were really concerned about digital because they were worried that they wouldn't be able to make revenue selling the tape libraries of Ken Burns' The Civil War and Nova seasons and Best of American Experience and all that. They were selling that. Well, it wasn't tape anymore. It was DVD at that point. It had barely transitioned to DVD from tape. And they're like, DVD is our savior because people are going to want to have these massive libraries. You can have a whole Nova season on your shelf. It's 4 inches wide when it's packed into these multi-pack DVDs, and people were collecting them. And they, that would be their PBS Fun Drive. They'd say, here, you can get this whole season of Nova. I keep coming back to Nova because that was the one that's top of mind. But they're not the only ones that were. Nature was another one that was doing quite well with these. Well, here's the problem. They knew that if everything went digital, people would be just streaming these things, and they wouldn't be collecting them anymore. And could you charge people for streams rather than that was, go back to 2005. That's the question. Well, the real problem that I had in talking to executives about this, they said, oh, that'll never end because people want to look on their shelf and feel good about what's on their shelf, right? And they were talking about DVDs. They weren't even talking about leather-bound editions of books.
Right.
We did that research. We did focus groups. We did surveys, national surveys, and we found out that, there's about 12% of people for whom they genuinely want to see their bookshelves or their video library represent them. To other people who come to their home and say, wow, look at your collection. 12% of people. And I said to them then, as soon as this is technically feasible, no one's going to buy another DVD. That was not a popular call in 2005. And I had to talk to the movie industry all the way through about 2009, when all of a sudden Best Buy cut their DVD sale or their DVD shelf space by 40%.
Oh.
Because they'd seen a 20% drop in sales. They're like, well, we're not going to waste all the shelf space on these things. And they cut it by 40%. Well, all of a sudden, that means people are buying even less because they don't see it. There's none of that. Anyway, don't ever say, oh, people will want to do in the future what they did in the past because they like it that way. That's never true. Anyway,
the last refuge of hope.
Yeah. No, I do think it was an overreaction, though, to suddenly ding CVS and Walgreens because Amazon's getting into that. Yes, that prescription model is going to change. It really should change for a lot of reasons, especially long-term medication scenarios, which is a large portion of the pharmacy business. You know, your child gets an ear infection and you need to just go down from the doctor's office to CVS to the house and administer the antibiotic or whatever. Okay, you absolutely need that retail environment. But if you're on statins, if you're on some kind of blood sugar medication, well, the name of the most common one is slipping right now. If you are on an antidepressant, if you're an anti-anxiety medication, think about this. This is actually a real problem. If you're taking anti-anxiety medication and you have a problem with your prescription, do you want to go down to a public place, stand in line, explain your situation to a pharmacist and have them look at their computer and say, well, that's not what my computer's telling me. Think about the anxiety compounding at that point. And I'm not advertising this. This is real. Yeah. I have people that are close to me who have had this problem and have needed someone else to go to the pharmacy with them to help them navigate the anxiety associated with getting their anxiety medication. Ooh. Whereas if you can go online, manage it all, have it delivered to you, that's actually a good solution. And CVS knows it, which is why they're, going to get into that business in a big way as well. So what a conversation that you and I have had for a long time, though, is where does Amazon start when it decides to change an industry? What behavior pattern does it target? And they didn't target browsing books while sipping coffee in Barnes and Noble. Mm-hmm. They targeted ordering any book and having it delivered anywhere. And then gradually supplanted book browsing at Barnes & Noble and Borders. And the same thing is true of a CVS model. You've been able to buy a lot of things you might buy at CVS on Amazon for quite some time. Supplements, health-related foods, and so on. But the one thing that you would buy regularly, monthly, would be your medications. And Amazon's particularly good at fulfilling subscription experiences. So, of course, that's the one that they're going to spend a lot of time mastering.
And they've got some other health initiatives. That Haven one has been rocky, and I saw the Tool Go On Day is no longer part of it. But
very disappointed.
Put all those pieces together.
Yeah. Disappointed that fell apart. I would love to hear the inside scoop on that. It had all the things it needed to succeed, but that doesn't always matter when you're working with very large companies in particular who all have different agendas. Also in a political environment where there wasn't a lot of goodwill towards people who are trying to innovate in healthcare. And that was unfortunate because really to reform healthcare in this country, we can't just try to change who pays for things. We need to change what healthcare means. And I'm not saying that Amazon is the best position to do it, but Amazon is in a great position to start the process of forcing the change that does need to occur. Education is the same way. It's an industry that needs to be disrupted. And back in 2008, actually, I was ready to write a piece about Steve Jobs being the potential massive disruptor that education needed back then, because he was already frustrated with the certification process of, how does Apple know who to hire when he needs to hire the best possible people, and education wasn't doing a good job signaling who was the best. And then he started to have his various bouts of cancer, and I decided to pull back on that and never wrote that piece. But that That still needs to be disrupted. So both these industries need to be disrupted for the common good, for the benefit of humanity. Who disrupts them is less important to me, but Amazon is certainly in a great position to disrupt potentially both of them. And in fact, one of our big calls in our employee experience and future of work predictions for 2021 is that Amazon, Google, or Apple or Microsoft, less likely Facebook, but who knows? One of them is going to potentially buy an accredited institution, a university, in 2021. That's our prediction. That's our bold prediction. We not only think it could happen, we probably think it should happen. And if you look at the education initiatives of all of those companies, they all have started to get very embedded in certification processes, which started out as we want to certify you as a Microsoft Azure or an Amazon AI or a Google cloud expert. And of course, they want that. They want more and more people out there certified in their tools. But they're finding that the certification needs go far beyond that. You need to be able to certify people's ability to use basic software tools, to be able to write, to be able to make sense of text in a way that a university used to be expected to do, and maybe shouldn't be in the future. So yeah, that's one that we think is probably going to come to some significant steps in 2021. Healthcare less so. I think that one's a harder one. It's even thornier, a briar patch than the education scene is.
Well, there's two topics I'd like to finish up with. One is I saw you wrote something at Forrester about companies need to get beyond sort of the current patchwork of unplanned workforce responses to the pandemic to something I think you called anywhere work, just a whole different way of imagining where and how people are working. And then I also want to know who you've forgiven recently and if you're still practicing forgiveness each day and what you've learned about how to be a good forgiver. That really stuck at me last time when you were saying that you can actually learn about forgiveness by actually doing it the way you learn to run by running. So maybe let's start with anywhere work and finish up with forgiveness.
Perfect. So anywhere work, yes, it's an awkward phrasing in the English language, and we know it, which is actually why we settled on it, because people keep talking about remote work. And we keep saying, if you are looking at remote work as this exception that people are forced into right now because of the pandemic, you're missing the whole point. 52% of people prefer to work from home. And we have been tracking throughout the whole pandemic the percent of people who say they, quote, can't wait to get back into the office when all of this is over. Back in March, it was in the high 50s. As of April and then into May, it was already mid-40s and 40. September of this year in the United States, it dropped to 30%.
Wow.
So, if you think about any time you hear an executive talk, and it's usually the executives, we just need to get people back into the office. That's where they feel the best. They're most productive. You have this serendipity of the water cooler, and they invoke all of these legends that are essentially post hoc rationalizations for the way they feel about being in the office. When you own a company, you're the CEO, you walk around the halls, you feel pretty good. Look at all this hive, this buzzing, all these bees are here. I did this. It's a huge ego rush. It has to be. But they also, if you're CEO, you're not early in your career typically, with the exception of a couple of startups. And so, if you're 60 years old, you've had 30, 40 years of working in offices. Most of your career, it wasn't even possible to Zoom.
Yeah.
Your idea of video conferencing circa 2002 was this very bulky piece of Volcom hardware that stood on the worked, and you had to use all these settings. And so, if you imagine that suddenly at age 60, you're just magically into the idea that, wow, we could have a remote workforce and we could just suddenly be productive in ways that we never imagined. No, that's not going to happen. So we're having a lot of pushback from executives, CEOs in particular, about, no, we need to get back into the office. We need to get back. So we have just been collecting the evidence. What's the evidence? And the evidence has been for some time that you experience no productivity losses when you move to an anywhere work model. And in fact, under certain conditions, people are more productive when they're in an anywhere work model. And one of the biggest predictors of engagement, which predicts productivity, is whether people feel like they have autonomy to accomplish goals with the appropriate resources. Now, some companies just aren't designed to give people autonomy. And as a result, they don't get engaged employees at the same level. And as a result, they don't have the same productivity. Now, you say that, say you need to give your people some autonomy, and their alarm bells go off. Their first response is, well, no, if I give people autonomy, they might not do their work. I need to be the effective taskmaster. That's just a mentality that they have, possibly from the era in which they were themselves working and, chained to a desk and not allowed to use the phone for personal phone calls. Can you imagine that? Back when my first job, and there was a phone there, and I had to dial in a code that was my personal code every time I used it so that they could control where that phone call went. No long distance phone calls, all that stuff. Now, people in every job have their personal phone with them, and in between tasks are checking Facebook, tweeting on Twitter, all of that. So, there's just a different mentality that a lot of these executives are coming to it with. So we just keep coming back with the evidence. What's the empirical evidence say? If you do it right, not only can an anywhere workforce be effective, it can be more effective, but you have to be willing to be the kind of company that enables that autonomy with resources. So, the big example that we keep pointing to is Siemens, the German manufacturer, which is said that the CEO came out and said, we have a very FaceTime culture. We think this is inhibiting the productivity of our people. We think it is making them be more about checking boxes and marking time on a calendar and less about being innovative solvers of problems. And so the Siemens has said they are officially going to grant everyone in a certain set of categories in roles, and it ends up being 120,000 people in their workforce will have the right to choose to work from home or some other remote model 2 days a week. That's, for a German company, I can tell you, that's an enormous culture shift. And my German colleagues are saying to me, we're watching that closely to see if it can happen. But it does take that kind of signal to people, because what's happening right now is that a lot of managers are being left stuck between the company saying, make sure your people are productive, and the employees saying, wow, I'm so productive at home. And actually, that is the case. A lot of clients are coming to us saying, our people are more productive. What do we do to sustain that? How do we make sure we don't burn them out, and so on? But if people are more productive at home, but the manager in the middle is saying, but you're still asking me to measure them on measures of effectiveness that were based on them being in the office.
Exactly.
So the manager, just so that they can do their job, would rather see people back in the office. No. So this can't just be the executives. It can't just be the people in their homes working remote. It has to be the whole culture, top to bottom, and line managers are crucial to that. That's why we say, let's stop calling it remote work. Let's call it anywhere work, so that we mentally are forced to make the shift. We understand it's a cultural change, it's a leadership change, it's a mindset change, and it's a technology and resources change. It's pretty large, but we think the companies that do it will come out of this pandemic just leaps and bounds ahead of the other companies that just gritted their teeth to work from home and then asked everyone to run back to the office as soon as it was safe.
Any clues as to whether Amazon is following that kind of a model?
Actually, it's very interesting. Amazon is on our list of companies that have specifically said we will come back to the office as soon as it is safe.
And it would be kind of counter to this.
Would be, and is very interesting from their perspective. They're saying that the in-person energy and work that people get challenged by and excited to contribute to requires an in-person office. Like I said, many people believe that. I would always ask for the evidence. If I were inside of Amazon right now, I'd say, great, that's our hypothesis. How are we testing whether that is true? Now, there's also an equality issue there. Careful what word I use, because I don't want to mislead people and think I'm talking about something I'm not. It's a haves and haves not issue at Amazon as well. most of the people that work at Amazon are in jobs where they don't really have that flexibility. We're thinking warehouse, we're thinking drivers and so on. And so to say to the cream of the crop at the top who are coding and on their laptops and making PowerPoint presentations all the time, hey, you guys can work from anywhere and everyone else can't. Mm-hmm. That could be very divisive. And honestly, I would respect Amazon if they came out and said, you know what, this is factoring into our thoughts. We're not sure that we can do this that in a way that doesn't create haves and have-nots of opportunity and lack of opportunity. And so we're just going to ask everyone to work from the office in the meantime. Interestingly, they are acquiring real estate like crazy. New York has reported, real estate brokers in New York have reported that Amazon is snapping up commercial real estate all throughout New York. Now, that could just be a really smart investment because all of those prices, I mean, they dropped by 40%. And as soon as this is over, you turn around and you sell it. And if there's a mad rush to get back into Manhattan, which there might be, I think that's more of one of those things that's going to be mid-2022 before it happens. But if you can even get it back to what the price was before the pandemic, that's 40% increase. That was a worthwhile investment. If you had a couple $1 billion to invest, that's a good way to tuck billions away for 2 years. But they have said it's not just about that. We do intend to have more people. Remember, they did the big, Amazon HQ2 initiative, and then that sort of petered out. We aren't going to have an HQ2. We're going to have lots of little HQ 2 point whatevers. And this is possibly the way they're going to fulfill that at a much lower cost. They don't even have to deal with the politics of the office in Brooklyn that they were trying to set up. They'll just have a whole bunch of offices spread throughout Manhattan and no one particular politician who gets to beat up on them all the time, but the mayor. It might end up being exactly what they wanted all along, and they just didn't know it.
Yeah. Well, how about forgiveness? I don't want to press you into the personal realm, but if there's anybody you forgave recently and you learned from it, but I'm interested in the arc of your learning about that topic because it seems very original to me.
Thank you for asking about that because it has been very important to me and to my wife both. We've talked about this tremendously because we do feel like, and the election season was a great time, here in the U.S. at least, to put that into practice. Because, of course, there are the people close to you that you have to forgive. And that's a more difficult journey. And, hopefully people are doing that. But what's happening these days on social media is that people are being angry and upset and offended by everybody. And it's a choice you make to be offended by all these people, but they're making that choice. And sometimes they think they're doing it for virtuous reasons. And what I have found, and this applies to some friends and family members and others, is that they don't realize the emotional toll they're taking on themselves by getting mad in the first place, which you then have to forgive. So maybe my growth in this journey of mine about forgiveness is to just make sure that you never get mad at someone in the first place, because then you don't need to forgive them for the thing you thought they did. Now, of course, that doesn't help if you're in an abusive relationship or you're in a situation where somebody's directly harming you or treating you poorly. I obviously can't say that you just never should get mad in the first place. Because if someone's causing you direct harm, that's understandable. But certainly you can cut out the need to forgive a whole bunch of people that you don't even know on Twitter. You don't even need to be upset with them in the first place. For example, after it became clear to me in the early days that President-elect Biden would be our next president, I just turned that question off. I didn't follow Michigan and Wisconsin. I didn't watch press conferences. I didn't care if even the president himself was arguing this outcome or that outcome, because I knew what was going to happen. I didn't need to get angry at all these people for everything they were going to do, for which I would later have to somehow forgive them in order to feel better. Well, now I don't need to forgive them because I was never mad in the first place. Now, what they did was, what they're doing, some of them is wrong and unfortunate. But one of the ways to even manage that is to say, what's that person, and this is maybe patronizing, but sometimes I see someone acting out in a public way and I think, what's that person missing? Not in a kind of Freudian way, like, oh, their mother dropped them on their head when they were 4. Their father was cold to them when they were 7, didn't go to the football game when they were 12, whatever. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean in, like right now. Maybe it's sunlight. Maybe it's sleep. We've talked about that before. Future fitness is extremely enhanced by whether or not you got a good night's sleep. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a neuroscientist and I want to say psychiatrist, not just psychologist. I think she's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist who I've quoted often in my research because she's really revolutionized the study of emotion. And she just wrote an op-ed piece, I think it was this week, where it's promoting her new book about things that we've learned from the brain that could be useful to you. And she's basically saying this. Says if something feels wrong, don't assume that it's actually psychological. Start with your body. Ask your body, why am I so angry at this person? And remedy those things first. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have a reason that you could be mad at that person, but maybe the way you're mad at them or the feelings that you're generating or the way you're coping with what they did to you, you could handle better in a way that's better for you and for them and for everyone else. So I'll just end the forgiveness conversation here with, I've been practicing 7 days of gratitude in advance of Thanksgiving in my social media feed. And so last Friday I started, and I was grateful for knowledge. I was grateful on Saturday for 30 years of marriage to a wonderful woman. That was our anniversary.
Nice.
Sunday I was grateful for forgiveness. And there was a wonderful piece in the New York Times on November 20th about a survivor of the Holocaust, who was a young man in Belgium, a young Jewish boy. I think he was 10 or 11 at the time. Absolutely spectacular story. He's still living in Brussels today. He came to this moment of decision where, as they were being put on a train and being sent to Auschwitz, and on the journey the train stopped and there was some issue that I wasn't familiar with. I'm going to do more reading about this. It turns out to be a fascinating story, evidently. But his mother said to him, jump off the train while it was moving. And he was young and he trusted his mother, and he did. And he looked back and he expected that she was going to jump, or his sister, his older sister, was going to jump, and they did not. And of course, they went to Auschwitz and did not survive. He was one of the many, this happens so often, it's just astonishing to me, who was then protected in the attics of Catholic families in Belgium until the end of the war.
Wow.
He lived something like 17 months in attics, protected and passed around from family to family so that they could also keep themselves safe. And he finds out that his mother and his sister died. His father succumbed to despair. It's really a touching story. People should definitely look it up and read it. But the crux of it is he later writes a book after years of not even talking about this. A friend persuades him to write a book about his experiences, and he does. And he gets some outreach from someone who had been a Belge, who was who was actually a guard of the convoy where this man's family had been assembled and sent to Auschwitz.
Wow.
And was, as far as I understand, not a war criminal, but was just part of the machinery that sent people off to their death, and had lived with that in absolute terror. Anyway, as the article explains, this man on his deathbed reached out to the survivor, the Holocaust survivor that I've been talking about, and said to him, can I basically confess to you? And it's a really touching story because the man says, the Auschwitz survivor says, it was a huge relief to him to be forgiven by me. And he said, it was a huge relief to me to forgive him.
Wow.
It's worth a read. You can tell it's quite emotional. But I thought of that.
I get the relief to the guy who was forgiven. Did he say more? What was your understanding of what was the relief to the survivor who forgave the person? Because he was carrying the same burden, just a different version of it or different side of it.
All I can tell you is just from my own experience that when you forgive, you feel love. You really do. Yeah, and that's why. And this is, it's touching on the less rational. I can't explain it. I'm sure people would have these theories about why and what it does. All I know is that it works.
It feels like love.
It does when you extend that grace to another human being. And if you want to know what feelings you should have today, we're coming up on Thanksgiving. What do you want to feel on Thanksgiving? Do you want to be angry about people who aren't being socially distanced? Do you want to be mad about the relative who posted something on Facebook about Donald Trump still being the president in January? You can choose those feelings. You can. But why? Why wouldn't you instead choose to love someone enough to forgive them? And I mean the real forgiveness, where you forgive even people who aren't ready to change the thing that you're forgiving them for. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to say exactly what the risks of this are. I don't know what they are. All I know is that love works, and it's worth it. So that's where I think I am at this point. 2 more days of Thanksgiving. Maybe I'll learn more between now and then.
Well, I'm grateful that I asked you the question, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. This has been good.
Thank you.
I have been speaking with James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Len.
That's it for this week's show. My guest next week will be Adam Leeb, CEO and co-founder of Astrohaus, creator of the Freewrite Traveler. That's an innovative tool for writers that I've mentioned here before, and I'm still having a great time trying it out. It's a dedicated keyboard for writing first drafts. And we'll hear about how he came to invent such a device and what are the kinds of things that you can do with it. Darlene and her sister Deb and I had a quiet Thanksgiving here on Sanibel Island off Fort Myers in Florida. And I also had a wonderful Zoom gathering with my family. My father, 93, was seeing all of us on his iPhone by Zoom, and we had 9 squares of family from around the area, including us here in Florida. So quite touching. I was frankly surprised. I spent a lot of time on Zoom, and that was kind of the most moving hour of Zoom time that I've had in a long time, and filled with a lot of gratitude. I learned today that longtime listener Mark Roberts, a friend of the show, has tested positive for the coronavirus, along with members of his family. He's not in any danger, apparently. The symptoms of sore throat, but boy, that just cuts too close to home, and Mark's in my prayers, and I hope you'll include him in yours as well. But also anyone else who has had COVID touch close, I don't know anybody directly in my family at this point, but with the recent surge, I'm sure there are perhaps many of you who have been touched by it, and I would be frankly interested in hearing what your experience has been. You can send me an email at podchronicles@gmail.com. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Sanibel, Florida. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.